Margaret Whitmore had buried her son 3 times. Each time, she thought it would be the last. But on a fog-thick morning in October 1917, she opened her front door to find him standing there again. Same dirty uniform, same bullet wound through his chest, same 17-year-old face that should have been rotting in French soil for months. He smiled at her with teeth too white for a dead boy and said the words that would haunt Whitmore Manor forever. "Hello, Mama. I've come home to stay." The Great War had already claimed 2 of Margaret's sons when Thomas enlisted in 1916. At 17, he was barely old enough to hold a rifle, but the army needed bodies, and Thomas Whitmore had always been eager to prove himself. Margaret watched her youngest march away that September, his uniform too big for his narrow shoulders, his eyes bright with the kind of innocence that wars devour first. The telegram arrived 6 months later. Killed in action during the Battle of Arras. No body to recover. Just another name on an endless list of the missing. Margaret placed Thomas's photograph on the mantel next to his brother's and tried to accept that all 3 of her boys were gone. But grief does strange things to the mind, especially in a house as old as Whitmore Manor. The plantation house had stood since 1823, built on land that had seen more than its share of death. During the Civil War, it served as a makeshift hospital where Confederate soldiers died by the dozens. Local stories claimed the walls themselves had absorbed so much suffering that they occasionally wept blood on humid nights. Margaret had always dismissed such tales as nonsense, but after losing 3 sons, she began to notice things. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors that opened on their own, the sound of young men's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for months. Then came the dreams. Every night, Margaret saw Thomas walking toward her across a muddy battlefield. He never seemed to get any closer, no matter how long she waited. His uniform was torn and stained with something dark. When he opened his mouth to speak, no words came out, only the distant sound of artillery fire. She woke from these dreams with the strange certainty that Thomas was trying to tell her something important, something about coming home. 3 months after the telegram, Margaret hired a medium named Constance Thorne. Constance was a thin woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a worn leather satchel and an air of quiet authority. "Your son is restless," Constance said before Margaret had even finished explaining why she'd called. "He's caught between worlds, the living and the dead." They held the séance in Thomas's old bedroom. Constance arranged candles in a perfect circle and instructed Margaret to place something of Thomas's in the center. Margaret chose his favorite book, a collection of ghost stories he'd read countless times as a child. The medium's eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming higher and younger. "Mama," the voice said through Constance's lips. "Mama, I can't find my way home." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Thomas, is that really you?" "The others won't let me leave. They say I belong with them now, but I don't want to be dead, Mama. I want to come home." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "What others? Who won't let you leave?" "The boys from the house. Your house. They've been waiting so long for someone like them. Someone young, someone who died far from home." The candles flickered as if touched by an invisible wind. "They showed me the way back," Thomas's voice continued. "Through the spaces between sleeping and waking, through the cracks where the living world touches the dead one. But there's a price, Mama. There's always a price." "What price?" Margaret whispered. But Constance's eyes snapped open, and when she spoke again, it was in her own voice. "He's gone." Something pulled him away. The medium packed her things quickly, her hands shaking. At the door, she turned back to Margaret with a haunted expression. "Whatever you do," Constance said, "don't invite him in if he comes back." Some doors should never be opened. Margaret didn't understand the warning then. She would soon enough. For weeks after the séance, the house grew quiet. No more footsteps, no more opening doors. Even the dreams stopped. Margaret began to hope that Thomas had finally found peace. She should have known better. The first sign came on a moonless night in October. Margaret woke to the sound of someone whistling Yankee Doodle in the hallway outside her bedroom. It was Thomas's favorite tune, the one he used to whistle while doing chores. She lay perfectly still, listening to the melody drift through the darkness. When it stopped, she heard footsteps moving away down the hall. Margaret grabbed a candlestick and crept to her door. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, but she could smell something that made her stomach turn. The sweet, cloying scent of flowers at a funeral. The next morning, she found muddy footprints leading from the front door to Thomas's bedroom. The prints were small, narrow, exactly the size of a 17-year-old boy's feet. But when she followed them upstairs, Thomas's room was empty. Dust covered everything like a gray shroud. No one had been inside for months. If you're enjoying this chilling tale of a mother's love that transcends death itself, make sure to subscribe for more haunting stories that will keep you awake long into the night. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The manifestations grew stronger. Thomas's voice began calling to her from empty rooms. Sometimes she would glimpse a familiar figure darting around corners, always just beyond clear sight. Once, she found his bedroom window open despite having locked it herself the night before. Margaret knew she should be afraid, but instead she felt hope blooming in her chest like a poisonous flower. Her son was coming back to her. Somehow, impossibly, Thomas was finding his way home. She began leaving food outside his bedroom door. Every morning the plate was empty. She started talking to the shadows, telling Thomas about her day, sharing memories of when he was small. Sometimes she swore she heard him laugh in response. The other residents of Millbrook County began to notice changes in Margaret Whitmore. She looked younger somehow, more vibrant than she had since before the war, but there was something unsettling about her newfound energy. Her smiles lasted too long. Her eyes held a feverish gleam. When Pastor Williams came to check on her, he found Margaret setting the dinner table for two. "Expecting company?" he asked. "Thomas is coming home tonight," Margaret said, arranging the silverware with careful precision. "He promised he would." My boy always keeps his promises. Pastor Williams had known the Whitmore family for decades. He'd officiated at all 3 funeral services for Margaret's sons. The look in her eyes now reminded him of something he'd seen during the war, the expression soldiers wore just before they broke completely. "Margaret," he said gently, "Thomas died in France." "You received the telegram yourself." "Telegrams can be wrong," Margaret replied, not looking up from the table. "Boys come home from wars all the time. Sometimes it just takes them longer than expected." That night, Pastor Williams stationed himself across the road from Whitmore Manor. He wanted to keep watch over Margaret, to make sure she didn't hurt herself in her delusion. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. At exactly midnight, a figure approached the front door of the manor. Even from a distance, Pastor Williams could tell something was wrong with the way it moved. Too stiff, too deliberate. Like a marionette, controlled by inexpert hands. The figure raised its hand and knocked 3 times. Pastor Williams heard Margaret's delighted laughter carry across the night air. "Thomas! Oh, my darling boy, you've come home." The door opened, spilling yellow light across the porch. In that brief moment, Pastor Williams saw the figure clearly. It wore a tattered military uniform. Its face was pale as moonlight and dotted with what looked like mud. Or perhaps something darker. But it was unmistakably Thomas Whitmore. The same Thomas who had died months ago in a trench thousands of miles away. Margaret embraced the figure, and Pastor Williams heard her sobbing with joy. Then the door closed, and the house fell dark. For 3 days, Pastor Williams watched the manor. He saw lights moving behind the windows, heard voices and laughter, occasionally glimpsed 2 figures sitting together in the front parlor. On the 4th day, concerned neighbors joined his vigil. Margaret hadn't been seen in town since Thomas's return. No one answered when they knocked on the manor's front door. Finally, Sheriff Coleman decided to investigate. He found the front door unlocked and the house filled with the overwhelming smell of decay masked by funeral flowers. In the parlor, he discovered Margaret Whitmore sitting in her favorite chair. She had been dead for days, but she was smiling, and in the chair across from her sat a figure in a rotting military uniform. The thing that had once been Thomas Whitmore turned to look at the sheriff with eyes like black holes. When it smiled, grave dirt spilled from between its teeth. "Hello," it said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Mama and I were just having the most wonderful conversation about old times." Sheriff Coleman ran from that house and never spoke of what he'd seen to anyone except his diary, which wasn't discovered until after his death in 1962. The other neighbors found Margaret alone when they finally worked up the courage to enter. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, but on the table beside Margaret's chair, they found a photograph. It showed a young man in military uniform, but his face was wrong somehow. Features shifted depending on the angle from which you viewed it. Sometimes it looked like Thomas Whitmore. Sometimes it looked like someone else entirely, someone with older eyes and a crueler smile. The photograph was buried with Margaret, but stories began to spread throughout Millbrook County. Stories about the thing that had worn Thomas Whitmore's face, about the other young men who had died in that house during the Civil War and had been waiting decades for someone to help them return. Some claimed Thomas had been tricked by the spirits of dead Confederate soldiers. Others believed he had become their willing accomplice in exchange for a chance to see his mother again. But everyone agreed on one thing: the dead should stay dead. Local historians discovered records showing that 17 Confederate soldiers had died in Whitmore Manor during its time as a military hospital. All of them were young men, far from home, who had died violent deaths. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves on the property. After Margaret's death, those graves were found disturbed, empty. For months afterward, people in Millbrook County reported seeing young men in old military uniforms walking the roads at night. They knocked on doors, claiming to be long-lost sons returning from war. Most families had the sense to keep their doors locked, but not all of them. The widow, Mrs. Henderson, swore her boy Samuel came home in November, even though Samuel had died at Gettysburg in 1863. She was found dead in her kitchen a week later, still setting the table for two. The Murphy family welcomed their son Patrick back from the Spanish-American War, despite the fact that Patrick had been buried for 15 years. When neighbors investigated after 3 days of strange sounds from the Murphy house, they found the entire family dead, all except Patrick, who smiled at them with borrowed features and asked if they'd seen his mama anywhere. One by one, the dead soldiers found new families to join, new mothers to fool with familiar faces, and one by one, those families joined them in whatever cold place exists between the living and the dead. The authorities tried to stop it. They brought in priests and investigators and men of science. But how do you fight an enemy that wears the faces of your loved ones? How do you turn away someone who claims to be your son, returned from war? By Christmas of 1917, Millbrook County had lost 43 residents to the walking dead. The survivors abandoned their homes and fled to other states, leaving behind empty houses and unmarked graves. Today, Whitmore Manor still stands. The county has tried to demolish it several times, but construction crews report tools that move on their own and the sound of young men's laughter echoing from empty rooms. Most workers refuse to finish the job. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to spend the night in the old house. Most lose their nerve before dark, but a few have accepted the challenge over the years. They're usually found the next morning, sitting peacefully in the front parlor with expressions of perfect contentment. When questioned, they claim they spent the evening talking with their new brothers about the old days and the war. Their families notice changes immediately. The teenagers become distant and cold. They speak in old-fashioned phrases and seem confused by modern technology. Within days, they disappear entirely. Some say they return to Whitmore Manor to join Thomas and his Confederate companions. Others believe they wander the countryside, looking for lonely families who might welcome a long-lost son. But everyone in Millbrook County knows the truth that Margaret Whitmore learned too late. Love can be a weakness that the dead know how to exploit. And sometimes, the son who comes home from war isn't the same boy who left. The footsteps you hear in your hallway at night might belong to someone you once knew. The figure standing outside your door in the darkness might wear a familiar face. But before you let them in, before you embrace them with tears of joy, remember Margaret Whitmore. Remember that some prices are too high to pay, even for love. Because in Millbrook County, the dead are still recruiting, and they're getting better at wearing the faces of the living. The question you should be asking yourself isn't whether this story is true. The question is, if someone you thought you'd lost forever knocked on your door tonight, would you have the strength to keep it locked? Thomas Whitmore is still out there somewhere, still wearing his 17-year-old face, still looking for a new family to call his own. He's learned so much since 1917 about how to seem alive, how to seem human. He's learned that the best lies are the ones people want to believe.
So when that familiar voice calls your name from the darkness, when those footsteps stop right outside your door, when that gentle knocking begins,
just remember, the dead don't stay buried in Millbrook County, and they're always, always hungry for company.